The city never slept, but on this particular night, its streets felt colder, emptier. The neon lights of expensive restaurants and towering skyscrapers reflected off the rain-soaked pavement as Alexander Carter stepped out of his luxury car. He was a billionaire, powerful, influential, untouchable. At least that's what he thought. With a sharp breath, he adjusted the cuffs of his designer suit and stepped onto the sidewalk, his mind occupied with business deals and bank figures. He had built an empire from the ground up, yet for all his success, he had little time for anything else. People, emotions, they had no place in his world. The street was quiet except for the distant hum of traffic. Alexander checked his watch. 11:45 p.m. He had just left an important dinner meeting at one of the city's most exclusive restaurants, where deals worth millions were signed over glasses of wine. His driver was supposed to meet him at the curb, but something felt off. A strange sensation prickled at the back of his neck, a feeling he wasn't familiar with. Unease. Before he could react, it happened. A force struck him from behind, sending him stumbling forward. Before he could regain his footing, rough hands grabbed his shoulders, pushing him into the shadows of a narrow alleyway. His heart pounded as his instincts kicked in, but he was outnumbered. A deep voice snarled, "Stay quiet, rich man, and this won't get messy." 3 men surrounded him. Their faces were hidden under dark hoodies, but their intentions were clear. One of them yanked his expensive watch off his wrist. Another searched his pockets, pulling out his wallet and phone. Alexander gritted his teeth, furious at himself for letting this happen. He wasn't a man who showed fear, but right now, he had never felt more vulnerable. "This is a mistake," he said, his voice controlled but firm. "You don't know who you're messing with." The tallest of the 3 laughed. "Oh, we know exactly who you are, Mr. Carter. That's the whole point." Alexander clenched his fists. He had always believed money was his shield, his power. But in this moment, it was his greatest weakness. Then, just as quickly as they had appeared, the thieves turned and ran, disappearing into the darkness. Alexander was left breathless, stunned. His wallet gone. His phone gone. His dignity shattered. He exhaled, trying to steady himself. He needed help. But how? And that's when he heard her voice. "Are you okay?" He turned. A woman stood at the entrance of the alley, her face illuminated by the warm glow of a street lamp. She was young, maybe in her mid-20s, dressed in a simple uniform with a small name tag pinned to her shirt. A waitress. Her eyes held genuine concern, not the kind laced with judgment or curiosity, just kindness. "Hi." Alexander hesitated. He had never been in a situation where he needed someone else's help, let alone a stranger's. But right now he had no choice. "You're hurt," she said, stepping closer. "Here, sit down." For the first time in his life, Alexander Carter, the billionaire who had everything, found himself relying on the kindness of someone who had nothing to gain from helping him. And what happened next would change everything. Alexander hesitated for a moment before lowering himself onto the sidewalk, his body still tense from the shock. The cold pavement sent a chill through his expensive suit, but at this point, comfort was the least of his worries. His mind was racing, anger, humiliation, confusion, all blending together. He had never felt this powerless before. The waitress crouched beside him, her hands resting gently on her knees as she studied his face. "You look shaken," she said softly. "Did they hurt you?" Alexander exhaled sharply. "No, just caught me off guard." His voice was steadier now, though a lingering edge of frustration remained. He wasn't used to being in situations he couldn't control. She nodded as if she understood, though Alexander doubted she really could. She was just a waitress, someone who probably struggled to make ends meet. What did she know about losing everything in a matter of seconds? "I'm Sophia," she said after a moment, offering a small smile. "And you are?" He almost scoffed. Did she really not recognize him? He was one of the most well-known businessmen in the country. His name was in headlines, his face on magazine covers. But as he looked at her, he realized she wasn't asking out of curiosity or any hidden agenda. She was just being polite. "Alexander," he said simply. "Well, Alexander, you don't look like the type who usually sits on the ground outside an alleyway." Her voice was light, almost teasing, but not in a mocking way. He sighed. "That's because I'm not." "Right." She shifted her weight slightly. "I work at the diner just across the street. If you want, you can come inside and sit for a bit. It's not much, but at least it's warm." Alexander hesitated. The idea of stepping into a place that was probably filled with late-night customers eating cheap meals felt strange. He wasn't used to places like that. He wasn't even sure if he had ever set foot in a diner before. His world consisted of 5-star restaurants, private chefs, and exclusive clubs. But right now he had no wallet, no phone, no way to contact anyone. And standing here alone in the dark, looking lost, wasn't exactly an option. With a reluctant nod, he stood up. "Lead the way." Sophia gave a small nod in return and turned, walking toward the small, brightly lit diner on the corner. Alexander followed, feeling a sense of unfamiliarity wash over him. The place was nothing like what he was used to. The neon sign above the entrance flickered slightly, and the inside was filled with the smell of coffee and grilled food. A bell jingled as they stepped inside, and a few customers glanced their way before returning to their meals. Sophia motioned toward an empty booth near the window. "Sit. I'll get you something warm." Alexander sank into the seat, the worn-out cushion beneath him feeling completely foreign. He ran a hand through his hair, still trying to process everything. This entire situation was surreal. A few hours ago, he was sipping on a $1,000 bottle of wine at a high-end restaurant, and now he was sitting in a run-down diner with a waitress offering him help. A moment later, Sophia returned with a steaming mug of coffee, setting it down in front of him. "It's not fancy, but it'll help." He glanced at the coffee, then at her. "You didn't have to do this." "I know," she said simply. There was something about her, something different. She wasn't asking questions, wasn't prying into who he was or what had happened. She was just there. It was a strange feeling, being treated like a regular person instead of a billionaire. He wrapped his hands around the mug, feeling the warmth seep into his fingers. "I don't suppose you have a phone I could use?" Sophia tilted her head. "Sure. Who do you need to call?" "My driver. Or my assistant." He hesitated before adding, "I need to get home." She pulled out her phone and slid it across the table. "Go ahead." Alexander took the phone and dialed a number he had memorized years ago. The line rang, and then went straight to voicemail. He frowned and tried another number. Nothing. His frustration grew as he realized he had no way to reach anyone at this hour. His company's security team would be available in the morning, but until then he was stuck. "Problem?" Sophia asked, watching him. "They're not answering," he muttered, running a hand down his face. She leaned against the edge of the table, considering him. "Looks like you're out of luck for the night." Alexander let out a dry laugh. "That's an understatement." Sophia studied him for a moment before glancing at the clock on the wall. "My shift ends in 20 minutes. If you want, I can walk you to a safe part of town or help you find a place for the night." He blinked at her. "You'd do that? Why not?" She shrugged. "You seem like you could use a little kindness right now." Something about her words struck him. When was the last time someone had helped him without expecting something in return? He had spent years surrounded by people who only wanted a piece of his success. Business partners, investors, even so-called friends. But here was this waitress, treating him like just another person who needed help. He exhaled slowly, staring into his coffee. "I don't even know what to say." "You don't have to say anything." For the first time in a long time, Alexander felt something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't just gratitude, it was something deeper. A reminder of the world outside his carefully built walls. But just as he was beginning to settle into this strange moment of quiet, something caught his attention. Outside the diner across the street, a shadow lingered near the alleyway where he had been attacked. A figure, barely visible in the dim light, stood watching the diner. His stomach tightened. Something wasn't right. Alexander's grip tightened around the coffee mug as he kept his eyes on the shadowy figure across the street. His instincts, sharpened by years of high-stakes business, told him that this wasn't a coincidence. The person wasn't just standing there, they were watching. Sophia followed his gaze, frowning slightly. "You okay?" Alexander hesitated, unsure of how much to say. If he told her he suspected someone was following him, she might think he was overreacting. Or worse, she might get involved in something dangerous. But he couldn't ignore the feeling creeping up his spine, the same feeling he had right before he was attacked. "I just thought I saw something," he said, trying to sound casual. Sophia didn't look convinced, but she didn't press the issue. Instead, she glanced at the clock on the wall. "My shift's almost over. Let me grab my things, and we can figure out where you're going." She walked toward the back of the diner, leaving Alexander alone with his thoughts. He took a deep breath and glanced at the window again, but the figure was gone. His pulse quickened. Had they left? Or were they just waiting for him to step outside? His entire life he had been in control. Of his businesses, his finances, his future. But now, for the first time, he felt truly exposed. Vulnerable. And he hated it. A low voice interrupted his thoughts. "You don't belong here, Carter." Alexander turned sharply. A man had slid into the booth across from him. His face partially hidden under the brim of a cap. His clothes were worn, his hands rough. There was something sharp in his eyes, something that sent a warning through Alexander's gut. "Excuse me," Alexander said, keeping his voice even. "You think you can just sit here, pretend like you're one of them?" The man gestured around the diner. "You don't know what it's like to struggle, to barely make it through the day. And yet, here you are, acting like you need help." Alexander studied him carefully. He had no idea who this man was, but it was clear he knew who Alexander was. "I didn't ask for help," Alexander said slowly. "I was robbed." The man smirked. "Oh, I know. And I also know that kind of thing doesn't just happen to guys like you. Someone wanted to send you a message." Alexander's stomach twisted. "Who?" The man leaned back, folding his arms. "You've made a lot of enemies, Carter. People who don't like how you do business. People who think you've taken too much for yourself." He tilted his head. Maybe tonight was just the beginning. Alexander clenched his jaw. He wasn't a stranger to business rivals, to people who envied his success. But this was different. This wasn't about boardroom deals or corporate competition. This was personal. Before he could respond, Sophia returned, stopping short when she saw the man sitting across from him. Everything okay?" The man stood up, sliding out of the booth. "I was just leaving." He shot one last look at Alexander. "Watch your back." Then, just as quickly as he had appeared, he was gone, disappearing out the door and into the night. Sophia sat down, looking between Alexander and the door. "Who was that?" Alexander exhaled, rubbing his temple. "I have no idea." Sophia studied him for a moment before speaking. "You look like you've just seen a ghost." "Maybe I have," he muttered. She didn't ask more questions, and for that, Alexander was grateful. Instead, she pulled her jacket around her shoulders and stood up. "Come on. Let's get you somewhere safe." Alexander hesitated before following her outside. The air was crisp, and the streets were quieter now, only a few cars passing by. The lights from the diner cast long shadows, making every alleyway and doorway feel like a hiding place for unseen eyes. Sophia walked beside him, hands tucked into her pockets. "So, what now? You don't have a phone, no way to contact anyone, and someone may or may not be following you." "Sounds about right," Alexander admitted. She glanced at him. "Do you have anywhere to go?" His instinct was to say yes, that he'd figure it out. But the truth was he didn't. Not tonight. Sophia sighed, rolling her eyes playfully. Well, lucky for you, I know a place. Alexander raised an eyebrow. And what place is that? My apartment, she said simply. He blinked. You're inviting a stranger into your home? He smirked. You're not a stranger. You're Alexander Carter, billionaire businessman. And if you were dangerous, I think you would have shown it by now. He wasn't sure if that logic was solid, but he didn't argue. He didn't have any better options. They walked in silence for a while, the city humming softly around them. Alexander felt the weight of the night pressing down on him. The attack, the man in the diner, the uneasy feeling that something bigger was happening. He had spent his life thinking money could protect him from anything. But tonight had shattered that illusion. Finally, they reached a small apartment building. Nothing fancy but not run down either. Sophia led him up a flight of stairs and unlocked her door, pushing it open. The space inside was modest but cozy, the kind of place that felt lived in. A couch, a small kitchen, books stacked in the corner. Sophia tossed her keys onto the counter. Make yourself comfortable. I'll get you a blanket. Alexander stood awkwardly in the middle of the room, feeling out of place. He wasn't used to this, being in someone else's space, relying on someone else's kindness. It was unsettling. As Sophia disappeared into the other room, he turned toward the window, looking down at the street below. That's when he saw it. A black car parked just down the road, engine running. And inside, a pair of eyes watching him. His breath caught. They had found him. Alexander's pulse quickened as he stared at the black car below. The headlights were off, but the engine was running, and the faint glow of a cigarette flickered inside. Someone was watching, waiting. He stepped back from the window, his breath steady but his mind racing. Was it the same people who robbed him? Or someone worse? The man in the diner had said this wasn't random, that someone had sent a message. And now, it looked like they weren't finished. Sophia walked back into the room, holding a folded blanket in her arms. Hey, you okay? Alexander hesitated. If he told her the truth, she might panic. And she had already done more than enough for him tonight. But keeping quiet wasn't an option either. Not when danger was sitting right outside her building. There's a car outside, he said, keeping his voice calm. I think it's been following me. Sophia frowned and set the blanket down. She walked over to the window, careful to stand to the side as she peeked out. Her expression darkened. That's not normal. No, it's not, Alexander muttered. She turned back to him. Do you recognize it? No, he clenched his jaw. But I don't think they're here by accident. Sophia crossed her arms, thinking. Okay, we have two choices. We sit tight and hope they leave, or we find a way out of here before they decide to come knocking. Alexander looked around the apartment. There weren't many exits. The front door was the only real way in or out, unless they wanted to risk the fire escape. We need to know if they're really watching us, he said. Or just waiting for me to step outside. Sophia nodded. She grabbed her phone and pulled up a ride-hailing app. Let's test something. She quickly typed in a request for a car and set the pickup location a block away. Few minutes later, a notification dinged. Drivers here, she said. Let's see what they do. They both moved back to the window, watching closely. A white sedan pulled up down the street. But the black car didn't move. They're not following that ride, Alexander murmured. They're waiting for something else. Sophia exhaled. For you. The realization settled between them like a heavy weight. Whoever was in that car wasn't interested in random movement. They wanted him specifically. Alexander's mind raced. He needed answers. Who was behind this? What did they want? And how far were they willing to go? He turned to Sophia. I can't stay here. It's not safe for you. Sophia scoffed. Oh, so you're the only one in danger here. She gestured toward the window. They know you're here, which means they know I'm here too. I think it's a little late for playing the protect the innocent bystander game. Alexander clenched his jaw. She was right. The second she let him into her apartment, She had stepped into whatever mess was unfolding. A sudden knock at the door made them both freeze. Alexander's muscles tensed. He glanced at Sophia, who was already moving silently toward the door. She peeked through the peephole, her breath hitching slightly. "It's my neighbor," she whispered. "An older guy, Mr. Jenkins." Alexander exhaled but stayed alert. Sophia opened the door a crack. "Hey, Mr. Jenkins, everything okay?" The elderly man looked concerned. "Sorry to bother you, dear, but I saw a couple of men standing by the entrance downstairs a few minutes ago. Didn't look like they belonged here." Sophia glanced at Alexander. He stiffened. Mr. Jenkins continued. "They didn't come in, but they were talking. Seemed like they were waiting for someone." Sophia forced a smile. "Thanks for letting me know. I'll be careful." Mr. Jenkins gave her a nod before shuffling away. She shut the door and locked it. "That's it. I'm not waiting around to see what happens next." Alexander nodded. "Agreed. But we can't just walk out the front door." Sophia tapped her fingers against the table, thinking. Then her eyes flickered toward the window. The fire escape. Alexander followed her gaze. It wasn't ideal, but it was their best shot. Without wasting another second, Sophia grabbed a small bag and shoved her phone, keys, and a jacket inside. "Let's go." They moved quickly, keeping their steps light. Sophia slid the window open, and a rush of cool air met them. She climbed out first, carefully stepping onto the fire escape. Alexander followed, shutting the window behind him. Below them, the street stretched out, quiet and empty except for the black car. It hadn't moved. Sophia pointed to the alley that ran alongside the building. "If we climb down to the second floor, we can jump down into that alley. There's a side street that leads away from here." Alexander nodded, gripping the metal railing as they moved downward. Every step felt like it echoed into the night. His heart pounded, but his mind stayed sharp. They reached the second floor. Sophia swung her legs over the railing, carefully lowering herself down. Alexander followed. Just as his feet hit the pavement, a sound made them both freeze. Car door opened. Then another. Alexander turned his head just enough to see movement near the black car. Two figures stepped out, their shadows stretching under the streetlights. They were coming. Sophia grabbed his wrist. "Run!" And they did. Alexander and Sophia sprinted down the alley, their footsteps echoing against the brick walls. The city around them felt eerily quiet, as if holding its breath. Alexander's mind raced. Who were these men? And what did they want from him? They reached the end of the alley, where a narrow side street stretched ahead. Sophia tugged his sleeve and pointed to a parked car a few feet away. "We need to keep moving." Alexander nodded, but before they could step out, the sound of footsteps behind them made them freeze. He turned his head slightly. Two figures had entered the alley, moving with purpose. They weren't running. They didn't need to. They knew Alexander and Sophia had nowhere to go. Sophia's grip tightened on his arm. "We need a distraction." Alexander scanned the area, his breathing uneven. That's when he spotted it. A row of trash cans lined up along the side of a building. He made a quick decision. With a sharp motion, he kicked the nearest one over, sending metal lids and garbage crashing to the ground. The loud noise shattered the silence, and for a split second, the men hesitated. That was all they needed. Sophia yanked Alexander forward, and they bolted across the street. The figures behind them cursed, their footsteps quickening. Sophia led them through another winding alley, past locked doors and abandoned crates. She clearly knew the area better than he did. Alexander's chest burned, but he pushed forward, fueled by adrenaline. They had to keep going. Finally, they emerged onto a busier street. Neon signs flickered in shop windows, and a few late-night pedestrians walked by, oblivious to the chase unfolding just a block away. Sophia grabbed his hand and pulled him toward a small convenience store. "In here." They slipped inside, the bell above the door jingling. The store was mostly empty except for a tired-looking cashier behind the counter. Sophia ducked behind a shelf stacked with instant noodles, pulling Alexander down with her. They crouched low, catching their breath. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator units and their own ragged breathing. Then Sophia whispered, "I think we lost them." Alexander exhaled, his mind still spinning. For now, he risked a glance out the window. The street looked normal, no sign of the men. But he knew better than to assume they were safe. Sophia's voice was quiet but firm. "Who are these people?" Alexander shook his head. "I don't know. But they're not just random thieves. This is something bigger." Sophia stared at him, her eyes searching. "You're sure this isn't about money?" Alexander hesitated. It had crossed his mind. Maybe someone wanted a ransom. Maybe this was about leverage. But deep down, something told him this wasn't just about his wealth. Before he could answer, the store door opened. A man walked in, tall, with sharp eyes that swept over the aisles. His gaze lingered just a second too long on the empty front counter before he casually stepped toward the back, pretending to browse the shelves. Sophia stiffened. Alexander didn't move. It was one of them. The man picked up a bag of chips, pretending to read the label. But he wasn't really looking at the snack. He was scanning the store. Searching. Sophia's fingers dug into Alexander's arm. They had seconds before he spotted them. Alexander made a split-second decision. He grabbed a baseball cap hanging from a nearby rack and shoved it onto his head. Then he reached for a magazine from the shelf and held it up, pretending to be absorbed in an article. Sophia caught on immediately. She grabbed a drink from the fridge and walked casually toward the counter, acting as if she were just another customer. The cashier barely looked up as she placed the drink down. "That all?" "Yeah," Sophia said, her voice steady. Alexander kept his head down, flipping the magazine pages slowly. The man was still moving through the store. He was getting closer. Sophia reached into her bag, pretending to fumble for cash. She glanced at Alexander, her eyes sharp with meaning. "Oh." Alexander took a breath and made his move. He stood up, keeping his face hidden behind the magazine, and walked toward the exit as naturally as possible. The moment he reached the door, he pushed it open and stepped outside. The cool air hit him like a shock, but he didn't stop. He kept walking, forcing himself to stay calm. If he ran, he'd attract attention. A few seconds later, Sophia caught up to him, her pace quick but controlled. She tossed her drink into a nearby trash can and muttered, "That was too close." Alexander nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. They needed to disappear. Completely. He turned to Sophia. "I need to find out who's behind this." She gave him a wary look. "And how do you plan to do that?" He hesitated, then reached into his pocket, remembering the only thing the robbers hadn't taken from him. A single business card. It was slightly crumpled from being shoved in his jacket, but the name was still clear. Elliot Price. Sophia frowned. "Who's that?" "A private investigator," Alexander said. "A very good one." Sophia exhaled. "So what, we just call him up and hope he solves this?" Alexander shook his head. "No. We go to him. Right now." Sophia hesitated, then nodded. "All right. But let's make sure we're not bringing trouble to his doorstep." Alexander glanced back at the store. The man was still inside, scanning the aisles. He hadn't realized they were gone yet. But, without another word, they slipped into the shadows and disappeared into the city. The city streets stretched ahead, dark and quiet except for the occasional passing car. Alexander and Sophia moved quickly, keeping their heads down. Every shadow felt like a threat, every distant sound made them tense. They had been running all night, but now they were close to finding answers. Elliot Price's office was tucked away in a dimly lit building downtown. It wasn't flashy, just a plain metal door with his name on a small plaque. Alexander knocked twice. For a moment nothing happened. Then, the door creaked open slightly, revealing a sharp-eyed man in his late 50s. His hair graying at the edges. He studied them for a second before stepping aside. "Come in." Alexander and Sophia slipped inside. The office smelled of old books and coffee. Papers were scattered across the desk, and a corkboard covered in photos and notes lined one of the walls. Elliot shut the door behind them. "Didn't expect to see you again, Alexander. Last time we spoke, you said you didn't believe in hiring people like me." Alexander exhaled. "Yeah, well, things changed." Elliot smirked. "They always do. Now, tell me what's going on." Alexander quickly explained everything. The robbery, the men following him, and how the whole thing felt like more than just a random attack. Sophia added details, describing the black car and the men who had chased them. Elliot listened, his expression unreadable. When they finished, he leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "You were right, Alexander. This isn't just a robbery. It's a setup." Sophia frowned. "A setup by who?" Elliot turned his monitor around. "I've been looking into your financials since the moment you called me. Something caught my eye." He pulled up a document and tapped the screen. "You recognize this?" Alexander leaned in. It was a contract, a business acquisition deal, one he had been negotiating for months. His company had been on the verge of merging with another major firm. But something was off. The numbers didn't add up. Elliot continued. "Right before you were robbed, someone moved millions out of one of your accounts. Not in your name, of course, but using access only a few people would have." Sophia's eyes widened. "Wait, you're saying?" Elliot nodded. "This was never about money in your wallet. Someone wanted you out of the way. And while you were busy running for your life, they were busy taking everything from you." Alexander felt his stomach drop. He had been so focused on survival that he hadn't thought about what was happening behind the scenes. "Who did this?" Elliot sighed, clicking through his files. Then he pulled up another document and turned the screen back around. "This name kept popping up in your records over the last few weeks. Someone quietly making changes, moving funds, preparing for something." Alexander's breath caught in his throat. It was his business partner, the one person he had trusted the most. Sophia glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "Alexander, what do we do now?" Before he could answer, a loud bang sounded from outside. Car door slamming. Elliot moved fast, shutting off the monitor and reaching for something under his desk. "They found you." Sophia's pulse raced. "How?" "We were careful." Elliot shook his head. "Not careful enough." Footsteps echoed in the hallway. Alexander's mind raced. He had to act fast. Then, just as the doorknob twisted, he grabbed Sophia's hand and whispered, "Follow my lead." The door burst open. Two men stepped in, their faces cold and determined. One of them smirked. "You've been making this harder than it needed to be, Mr. Lancaster." Alexander forced a calm expression. "And you've been making it obvious who you work for." The man's smirk faltered, but only for a second. "You should have just stayed down when we took your money." Alexander's jaw tightened. "And you should have covered your tracks better." For a split second, silence filled the room. Then Elliot moved. In one swift motion, he pressed a button under his desk. A shrill alarm blared through the building. The men flinched. That was all Alexander and Sophia needed. Elliot reached into a drawer and threw something to Alexander. A small flash drive. "Take it. Everything you need is on there." Alexander grabbed it without hesitation. Sophia yanked the door open and they ran. Behind them, the men shouted, but the alarm had done its job. The noise sent people into the hallways. Residents, workers, all stepping out to see what was happening. Too many witnesses. By the time the men pushed past the crowd, Alexander and Sophia were gone. They didn't stop running until they were halfway across the city, standing near a quiet park. The weight of everything settled on Alexander's chest. He looked at the flash drive in his hand. Sophia caught her breath. "That drive. It has proof, doesn't it?" Alexander nodded. "Enough to ruin him." Sophia exhaled. "So, what now?" Alexander stared at the skyline. He had been robbed, chased, and nearly taken out. But now he had the upper hand. He turned to Sophia, his expression determined. Now, I take everything back. The night air felt heavy, but for the first time since everything had started, Alexander wasn't running. He stood there in the park, the flash drive still clutched in his hand. The proof he needed to expose everything was right there, but the real question was, what now? Sophia watched him carefully, her breathing still unsteady from the chase. We need to get this to the right people. Alexander nodded. Elliot probably has contacts who can help. If we go to the police, they'll need solid evidence. Sophia crossed her arms. And what if your business partner already has people in his pocket? Someone who can make this all disappear? Alexander hesitated. It was a real possibility. He had trusted the wrong people before. He couldn't afford to do it again. His partner had already taken so much from him, but Alexander still had one thing left. His name. His voice. We don't just take this to the authorities, he said slowly. We make it public. Sophia's eyes widened. Public? If I go straight to the police, they might stall. Investigations take time, and in the meantime he could cover his tracks. But if the world sees this, if investors, the media, and the board members find out, he won't be able to hide. Sophia's lips pressed into a thin line, but after a moment she nodded. All right. Then we need to move fast. They made their way to a small internet cafe on the edge of town. It was nearly empty, just a couple of tired workers scrolling on their phones. Sophia paid for a computer while Alexander plugged in the flash drive. His heart pounded as he opened the files. Everything was there. Emails, financial transactions, messages confirming the setup. His partner had orchestrated the entire thing, planning to remove Alexander from his own company while making it look like he had simply disappeared. It was a betrayal so deep that Alexander felt sick just looking at it. Sophia leaned over his shoulder. This is enough to destroy him. Alexander opened a secure email and sent the files to Elliot. Then he took it one step further. He drafted a message to a well-respected journalist, attaching everything. He kept it simple. No emotion, no anger, just facts. The truth about Lancaster Industries. You'll want to see this. He hit send. It was done. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Sophia leaned back in her chair. So what happens now? Alexander exhaled, his shoulders finally loosening. Now we wait. The response was faster than expected. Within an hour, Elliot texted him. Good work. The media will eat this up. Stay safe. By morning, the news had exploded. Articles flooded the internet exposing the scheme. Reporters dug deeper, finding even more corruption tied to Alexander's former partner. Investors panicked. The company's board held an emergency meeting. Alexander watched it all unfold from a small motel room, Sophia sitting beside him. Every major news channel was covering the story. The betrayal, the financial manipulation, the attempted cover-up. His partner was finished. Then the biggest blow came, a live press conference from Lancaster Industries. The board's chairman stood before the cameras, looking tense. Effective immediately, we are severing all ties with our former CEO and launching an internal audit. We deeply regret these events and are committed to restoring trust. Sophia turned to Alexander. That's it. It's over. Alexander nodded slowly. He had won. Not in the way he ever expected, but in the way that mattered. His company was saved from the hands of a corrupt man, and the truth was out. A few days later, Elliot met them at a quiet cafe. He slid a newspaper across the table, smirking. They're calling you the billionaire who lost everything and got it all back. Alexander picked up the paper, shaking his head. I don't care about the title. I just wanted justice. Elliot chuckled. Well, you got it. Your partner was arrested this morning. Fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy. He won't be walking free anytime soon. Sophia grinned. That's the best news I've heard in weeks. Elliot leaned forward. And what about you, Alexander? You going back to the company? Alexander thought about it. The board had already reached out, offering him a chance to return. But after everything that had happened, he wasn't sure he wanted to step back into that world. He had spent years building that empire, only to realize how fragile it had been under the wrong people's influence. He looked at Sophia. She had risked everything to help him, even when she had no reason to. She had been a waitress just trying to get by, and now she was sitting here, someone he trusted more than anyone. No, Alexander finally said. I think it's time for something new. Elliot raised an eyebrow. New? Alexander smiled. I want to rebuild, but differently this time. A business that actually helps people. Something real. Sophia tilted her head. That sounds good. Elliot nodded, clearly impressed. Well, if you ever need an investigator again, you know where to find me. Alexander laughed. Hopefully I won't have to. They shook hands, and Elliot left, leaving Alexander and Sophia alone. Sophia stirred her coffee. So, what now? Alexander took a deep breath. The past few weeks had been a storm of betrayal, danger, and uncertainty. But now, for the first time, the future felt open, full of possibilities. He looked at Sophia and smiled. Now, we start over. She smiled back, and for the first time in a long time, Alexander knew he was exactly where he was meant to be.